There are multiple barriers to accessing healthcare in Montreal, and these barriers can be amplified for marginalized communities. The Trans Patient Union has for mission to improve the standards of care received by the trans community in Montreal. Today, I am talking with Jacob Williams, an administrator and the founder of the Trans Patient Union, on the issue of accessing healthcare as a trans patient, the obstacles and barriers faced, as well as ways to mobilize for an easier access to trans healthcare. For those who are watching, can you explain what the Trans Patient Union is?
Sure, yeah. It has like two basic functions. This is kind of like how we like to think about it. On the one hand, we like to advocate directly to our providers to try and convince them to give us better care. This means the improving of standards of care, which are often very poor for trans patients, and also can mean the giving of new services as well at various clinics and with various providers. We have like a decent working relationship with the McGill Wellness Hub, and we're working to expand this to other clinics in Montreal as well. That's sort of the first thing we do is like so advocacy directly to clinics. And then the second thing we do is like we try and help people navigate the day-to-day issues of their transitions. So we write guides, we collect data on patient experience, and we try to help people navigate these like all the barriers that they will face. So it's sort of like we try and address the institutional problems, then we try and do everything we can to help individuals navigate those institutions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. In terms of work as well, I know that recently, in collaboration with Project 10, the organization has been holding workshops on how to survive Montreal healthcare as a trans patient. Could you speak a little bit about that?
About those workshops?
Yeah, about those workshops. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We've been providing them for a little while. We started them summer of of the most recent summer. Basically, the workshops titled "How to Survive," usually something along the lines of like "How to Survive Montreal Healthcare as a Trans Patient." We try and give people like sort of a survival guide type style of presentation about like the ins and outs of like navigating the system. There's like a more practical section of like here's how to get HRT in Montreal, here's how to deal with the GRS surgery clinic. But then we also provide people with like general information, like the kind of attitudes and insights and like know-how that you need to know to like navigate these complicated institutions. We also provide a critical analysis of like all of the problems. So it's like we usually break it up into three sections. We have the first section, which is like understanding the healthcare issues in Montreal and the transphobia involved. Then we have like the practical guides and like how to advocate for yourself section, and then you have a section on patient unionization and like broader structural advocacy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And could you speak on how transition access is across Montreal for trans patients?
Sure, yeah, it's
In
very bad. Transition access in Montreal is really difficult. So many of the problems, like any patient in Montreal, like has horror stories about navigating Montreal's healthcare system. Trans patients have to deal with all of those, and then they also have their own specific issues to deal with healthcare. In the transphobia section of the presentation, we usually break it down into like three distinct sections, or somewhat distinct, three big problems when it comes to transphobia in healthcare, like in Montreal and elsewhere, where you have like there just isn't a nobody like really cares about trans patients. Nobody like takes into account our like transition in like medical curriculum or in research. It's just like not considered an important part of healthcare. Anything that doctors know about trans patients, they've had to learn in their free time by doing quote unquote extra work to go the extra mile to care about trans people. There's like no information about trans patients, so just doctors don't know about it. Any general practitioner in Quebec can prescribe hormones for gender transition. The vast majority do not. They do not, and they will not if you ask them to. They just won't do their jobs, is kind of what it boils down to. They won't do it because they were never taught how to. And even when they are given resources, most of them will simply refuse to do so. There have been so many times when organizations and individual trans patients have reached out to their doctor time and time again with all these resources, with these workshops, with these training guides, with connections to other doctors who know how to provide hormones or other trans care. And they will just not do it. They just don't. There's just a general attitude amongst providers that it's just not their job. Hormones, that's not my job. Go see someone else. Go get on one of the 10 wait lists that you'll have to be on for 2 years to see like one of the handful of doctors in the city who's like willing to basically do their job. This is like I think like the big crux of like the issue that people that like a lot of people don't know about. Like a lot of people are aware of like the extensive wait times. A lot of people are aware of like the like austerity in healthcare, but like a lot of the issues just boil down to like providers just don't really think trans care is important and trans patients are important, and so they just don't like take the time to include them or make sure that their services are like available for trans patients.
Would you be able to speak on what kind of obstacles and barriers that trans patients face when trying to access healthcare?
I can talk about some of the other barriers too. I think like the big main one is like, in my view at least, like the biggest barrier is the one I just mentioned, where trans patients and transition access are just not seen as like real medical care. They're just not seen as serious and real medical care that like needs to be taught to people and that people need to know about. It's seen as like this niche secondary issue that can kind of like, oh, go see this specific clinic, go see this, go see that, but like it's not integrated as part of healthcare. So, like, obviously, it's very hard to get access to transition, but other aspects of just being a patient while trans is very difficult. So, like, from being able to have an X marker recognized at your clinic, from changing your name, but also like basic medical things that you would think would be like the doctors would just know about. Like, it's actually very hard to find a gynecologist if you're trans and you're on hormones, or if you have like a neovagina because you're trans feminine. Doctors just aren't broadly taught how to deal with those patients. And so it's kind of like you just show up to a doctor's office and they just don't know how to answer your questions. They don't know how to address your medical concerns. They've never heard of your problems before. And so it's up to you to go hunting around for a doctor who does know. And that doctor is probably very hard to access because every other trans person is trying to like get that doctor. Or if they are available, it's because nobody's heard of them yet. They're very obscure and hard to find. So what you end up is with trans people are like more likely to have various like issues when it comes to mental health, but also like are much more likely to be like disabled when it comes to like physical disabilities. So we have like all these mental and like physical health issues, and providers don't know how to address us because they aren't educated on the special health needs of trans patients. Um, Another issue I might say that's really important is there's a lot of like there's like a long legacy of gate kept like medical barriers. This is what most people think of who are at least a little bit aware of trans people when they think of like issues with trans healthcare. They think of like medical gatekeeping. There is a lot of medical gatekeeping. It is a big issue. Um, it's being kept, in my view, one very important player that people don't really talk about as much is insurance companies. Insurance companies are definitely one of the big reasons why medical gatekeeping is still being kept around, because they want quote unquote proof that any procedure is medically like necessary for, medically necessary, like in this like strict sense. So like when you get some sort of gender affirming procedure covered by RAMQ, covered by your private insurance, whatever, they need to be able to justify this expense by claiming that it is medically necessary in some way. And this means that you have all these like additional sort of barriers that rise up. So that you can access care, you need to get a gender dysphoria diagnosis. You need to maybe get a gender incongruence diagnosis. Maybe you need to have some sort of like registered like other type of status, and these things can be like expensive to get if you don't have access to healthcare. If you don't have access to a therapist or private insurance, how are you going to get like those diagnoses? Um, yeah, so that's like another big barrier for a lot of patients.
So the Quebec government decided to pull like a 180 on its policy for ex-gender markers. I know at first they said that they would not be able to make a decision until winter 2025. Can you explain how impactful proper gender markers on ID can be when it comes to receiving the care you need in health institutions?
Yeah, I think like I can speak a little bit to this issue. I'll be frank. Getting like the ID stuff with the SAC and everything, it's not like we do like guide people to resources when it comes to name change and recognition, and we have somebody at our group who's part of the jury trans and is a commissioner of oath, but it's not our primary focus. We tend to focus more on the medical side. But I can tell you that like having correct legal documents and documents that can like be integrated within greater health networks and health systems is really important for accessing medical care. A little while ago at a clinic in Montreal, tell you a little bit of an example of this. This will give you a sense of why it's so important to have these like accurate documents that are not just don't just reflect your gender identity, but also um, work with the rest of the RAMQ's complex insurance and medical system. Um, is this example of I think about a year ago now, at one of the health clinics in Montreal, where there was a number of trans patients at this health clinic. It's near the gay village. There was a case of they were submitting, the providers there were submitting blood work that trans patients needed to check their HRT levels. And what they realized was, and they sent it to a local hospital where they were doing the blood test there. And what they realized after like a couple months is that they weren't getting any of their blood tests back for any of their trans patients. And this was like really weird. And so they did a bit of research, and like called up the hospital and figured out what's going on. And what they realized after investigating was that the hospital was throwing out all of the blood work requisitions and the blood test samples of trans patients who were being sent to the hospital for testing. Um, they were just throwing out the blood test. This is actually a relatively common issue where this is what I mean when I say like they're not like built with us in mind. Like they'll just throw out our blood tests, blood tests that you may have paid for, right? That you probably paid to get shipped there, that the RAMQ is paying money, that that everybody's paying money to have these services done that are very important. And the hospitals are just throwing it out. And the reason they were throwing out the blood tests was because the clinic had a preferred name change system where you had your legal name first, and then following it, you had your preferred name in parentheses. This is like kind of the common workaround for clinics when they want to include some preferred name system, but they can't get rid of your legal name on your documents. And so since that didn't match perfectly somebody's RAMQ, where it was just their legal name and no preferred name in parentheses, this meant that they were just throwing out, they're like, oh, this name doesn't match this name on the requisition. So they were just throwing out all of the blood tests. They didn't think, oh, I should call the clinic about this. They didn't think, oh, like maybe there's some reason why this is, I should like call a doctor or whatever. They just threw it out. They didn't care. And they just did that for months. And tons of patients had to get retested. Their care was delayed, and they had to do more blood testing because this because this hospital was just throwing out people's blood tests. Is absolutely ridiculous. And this is also an issue with the marker. I'm actually very concerned about like a while ago I've heard some people say things like, oh, well, we can't change the marker on like the health card because that's important for accessing certain health services. This is pretty misleading. Um,
Mm.
for example, when I had a F marker on my health card, sometimes I would submit blood tests and they would get rejected because my blood test was for testosterone, and I was getting a male blood test because I'm on male hormones, obviously. So they were throwing out my blood test based off of my F marker. So like there's some people think that like an M or an F marker tells you everything you need to know about a patient's biology, but actually if we just went with sex assigned at birth for people's M or F checks, this would make it impossible for trans patients to get care that aligns more closely with the other like sex how would like trans feminine people access like gynecologists? How many referrals for
Mhm.
gynecology would just get thrown out because some doctor would look at it and go, oh, that's an M, I don't need this, and they would throw it out. So first of all, we need doctors to stop throwing out blood tests based off of M and sex. We just wish that they would just do the test and think to themselves, oh, this is probably a trans person who needs a hormone test for testosterone, even though they have an F marker. And people who want an X marker should 100% just be allowed to have an X marker.
Perfect. Thank you so much for all this information and even like giving us an example of what can happen and what has happened. I wanted to ask, which we also kind of touched on, what kind of issues and consequences can come from trans patients not being able to access the healthcare they need and deserve?
Um, the kind of the impacts that can happen to anybody when they can't access their healthcare. Healthcare is such a critical part of like our basic human rights, like being able to access good medical services. Um, Trans patients can face all sorts of medical issues. There's a lot of focus when you hear about this sort of stuff. Like people will talk about like the suicide rates of trans patients and the mental health of trans patients who can't access healthcare. Those are all very real and very important. But it's also just like a lot of the times there's also like the actual medical aspect. Like um, people like suffering with like complex health conditions that they don't understand, that they can't get medication for, that they can't get treatment for, that they can't get referrals for years and years and years because they can't access the basic healthcare that they need. And often because like not even just they can't access the healthcare that they would need to access doesn't exist, right? Like there are certain issues for trans patients that just aren't studied. Like how are you supposed to see a doctor about an issue that nobody knows about, that there is no doctor about, possibly like in your city or even in your province? um, so yeah, it can have like really profound health impacts on trans patients. It can have really profound mental and like personal impacts on trans patients. um, it's a very intimate. We speak to a lot of trans patients who issues vary from like more medical to more transition related, and like obviously when you're unable to access transition, that impacts you in a very like in a very intimate and like very very personal way. It's a huge like encroachment on that kind of like very fundamental liberty. But then there's also just like having a chronic pain condition that like you can't see a doctor about because no doctors are like willing to see you or understand your problem.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Um, I had a few more questions. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said that the province will ban puberty blockers and hormone therapy for children 15 years old and younger, and that top and bottom surgeries for people 17 and under will also not be permitted, and that she wants this to be legislation by fall. Are you concerned that despite this being a decision made in the West, it could come to affect the access to healthcare in Quebec for trans patients?
Oh yeah, this is something we worry about a lot. To be honest, like when we heard about the news in Alberta, people kept messaging me joking like, "Oh, what are you gonna do when like trans healthcare is illegal? Like, what is your organization gonna do?" Kind of half jokingly. Um, no, it's very very concerning, especially with like all the general sort of like transphobia coming from like the premier and like this coming to this nonsense. Um, I'm a little bit I'm a little bit hopeful because I find that there is a at least in my view, there's like a pretty strong and well connected trans and queer advocacy network that exists in Quebec and in Montreal specifically. There are so many like when the Bill 2 stuff happened. I don't know if people remember, but like they wanted to like change the name change requirements for trans people and basically like bring the standard back to like push it back like decades. It would have made it the most regressive system in Canada by far. They wanted like the first proposal was like horrible. Um, it was like queer and trans groups who like stopped everything basically to like in their tracks like build a huge like well connected advocacy plan and were able to transform that legislation into the most progressive name change legislation in Canada. And that makes me really proud to be in this community of organizers. Like not like I was obviously I was not part of that, but like we weren't really an org yet when that happened. But like it makes me proud to be like part of this wider community of people who are doing this really important work. um, Obviously I'm not obviously we don't want to be put in a similar situation like that again, especially not with this healthcare stuff. But I'm very concerned about the province. I'm very concerned about this country. I'm very concerned about Alberta. But I also have I have hope for I have hope for us in the face of all of this. Just a note about the puberty blocker stuff. Banning it like below the age of like what is it, 16, 14? What did she want to ban it for?
For children 15 and younger.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. You're
Um,
just banning puberty blockers at that point. Nobody's getting on puberty blockers at like 16 or whatever. Like the whole point of puberty blockers, like to be honest, puberty blockers themselves are kind of a contested history. Like puberty blockers were introduced specifically because of like kind of transphobic concerns like these originally. Um, the medical community didn't want to let people transition. They didn't want to let people who were really young transition. So people who were like in their early teens or like even younger, they didn't want to let them access testosterone at the same age that their peers would be experiencing their first puberty. Hormone puberty blockers were literally introduced as a compromise between like medical providers and trans people. Puberty blockers are not medical transition, really. They're stalling your puberty. so that you can choose to either continue it as you would have later when you go off of the blockers or begin your transition. So the idea that they're being blocked is so hilarious because this is literally like the compromise that was introduced so that people under the age of 15 or whatever don't have to choose to transition. Choosing to go on puberty blockers is not choosing to transition. It's choosing to delay that choice until later. So the idea that it's like being blocked by this like legislation or people who are like, oh, we must ban puberty blockers is so ridiculous. These people don't know what the medication is about. They don't understand why it was introduced. And frankly, I find it offensive that like this is like where we are battleground wise. Like I'm strong in Quebec. The age of medical consent is 14. Um,
Mhm.
and people can choose all sorts of medical procedures at this age. This should be the age for medical. If this is the age that people can consent to things, to all sorts of medical procedures, this should be the age that people can consent to transition. This should be the age that people can start HRT as well. So the idea that like we would somehow wait even longer because trans people are special and this is somehow a different decision than every other elective procedure that people undergo is offensive. And it's crazy. You should just let people transition at the same age that you let people make other decisions. So the idea that they would lose even that right when we should be talking about this other issue is really ridiculous. You know, starting your first puberty late does not come without its downsides. Um, uh, and if a young trans person wants to begin, you know, HRT at the age of 14, they shouldn't have to go on puberty blockers until they're like 16 or whatever. Um, it's you know it I find it all quite frustrating to watch.
Thank you so much. I feel like there's a lot of misconception regarding, as you said, healthcare you receive for your transition when you're a younger. And you mentioned in your last answer how um, starting your transition later can actually be detrimental. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
um, I won't use the word detrimental in that specific situation. I should say um, to be clear, the thing I was just mentioning about was people on their hormone blockers, right? They're beginning the positive effects of their transition, so actually experiencing estrogen and testosterone, they experience those things later, and I don't think they should be robbed of the opportunity to begin that sooner. If they are like
Hmm.
14 or 15, they should be allowed to begin the process. Um, so I don't think that that is like, but something that people usually will say is detrimental is being delayed the ability to pause or being delayed like the ability to begin it when you're older. So um, like being able to be on puberty blockers is obviously a better situation than actually experiencing the puberty you don't want to, right? But like usually when people talk about the detrimental effects, they're talking about people who are stuck with the wrong hormones, unable to pause them or access the hormones that they want, um, or access other aspects of their transition, whether it's like mastectomies, top surgeries, bottom surgeries, whatever. Um, yeah, it can be really detrimental to be unable to access your transition. Um, uh, I don't want to get like too like sad story about it. It's kind of a heavy topic, and there's already lots of people out there who will tell you all about like the horrible like mental health aspects that this can like have on somebody who's unable to transition. Um, but yeah, it's very very difficult. Being unable to transition can really derail somebody's life. It can end somebody's life. It is very serious. But beyond that, like I don't want to just sit here and say, oh, we need to make sure that trans people have access to transition or else they'll kill themselves. Because, like, it is true, like, a lot of trans people will kill themselves if they cannot access transition in a meaningful amount of time. But I don't think that should be, like, the point. I wish that people just respected people's choice to transition and undergo elective medical procedures that they feel are deeply important to them and that they've been properly consented on, regardless of if it's a life or death situation. Um, Also, there are lots of trans people. Like, obviously, for a lot of trans people, if they can't access transition, this is a life or death problem for them. But for a lot of trans people, it's not. And that's okay too, you know? Um, a lot of trans people will want, especially some of the later procedures. Um, for a lot of trans people, they simply want it because it will make them, it is very important to them. It is a deeply important decision for them. They wouldn't die if they didn't have it, but I don't think that should be the bar of whether or not we give people access to the medical procedures they want. It should not be about life or death. It should be about we want people to be able to make decisions with informed consent You know, if you understand properly the choice that you have ahead of you, and you've had enough time to think about it, and you feel prepared to affirm your consent about the situation, and you're in a position where you can consent, then you should be able to do that. And it shouldn't be about whether or not, it shouldn't be about displaying some sort of like awful agony about the situation, this sort of like kind of like this like deeply depressing like trans like displays of like suffering and all this. There's a long history of like trans people having to do that as part of their medical gatekeeping process, basically display huge amounts of suffering in order to access care. And not only is having to display that kind of a humiliating process and like deeply unfair to patients, but it shouldn't be necessary. It shouldn't be about that. It should be about like, you want this thing, you are well informed and in a good position to make this decision, you will get this thing. And that's what it should be about.
Thank you so much. Um, if if the CAC, like the Coalition Avenir Québec, were to try and adopt a similar legislation than what Daniel Smith is trying to do in Quebec, what could Montrealers do to counter the legislation, such a legislation?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say just stay posted with like the various trans and queer orgs that you're already following, if you are following any, and if you aren't, like there are so many in Montreal. I'm sure Celeste Trenel will post something on her Instagram about it as soon as it drops. There will be many other orgs posting statements about it. I'm sure that there will be protests, that there will be email campaigns, that there will be direct petitioning from these organizations to their connections, like to various like networks of important people who make these decisions. Um, uh, it will be there will be an insane push basically across like Montreal or across Quebec. Huge like organizations will stop everything that they're doing and make sure that like they can do everything that's possible for this not to happen. From the well connected queer and trans organizations to the on the ground advocacy of like grassroots organizations, everybody will sort of like pause to like push against this. It would be a huge, huge, huge step back for trans people and for trans patients, and especially for trans youth. Um, just a note about trans youth. Um, it's really sickening to watch like conservative politicians be the ones to say, "Oh, trans youth this, trans youth that," and like in this way where like they say that they need to do this because they're defending young trans people, like they're the ones who are protecting young trans people by denying them access to hormones, but they are actually the ones in these actions marginalizing young trans people the most. It is, I can tell you, like from our experience speaking to young trans people, so usually like trans people under the age of 18, they are the ones who struggle the most out of all the people that we speak to in accessing like trans healthcare. They struggle the most because doctors are the least likely to be willing to work with them. Doctors are the most likely to like whip out their like 1970s ass fucking textbook of like bullshit, and whip out all these outdated and like discriminatory practices. Like when they really should just be using like various like modern, well approved, like informed consent models. Doctors will drop all of that to become extremely skeptical of everything and use all these outdated and offensive methods that are time consuming and expensive. And because these are young trans people, they're unlikely to be well informed. They're unlikely to be well connected to other trans people who could walk them through the process. Their parents are likely to know nothing about their rights. These are young trans people who are not in a position where people are going to tell them about their rights when they're accessing healthcare. There are so many, like just the other day when I was at a workshop, a young trans patient, I think, yeah, a young trans patient said that then when they were 15 or 16, when they were trying to access HRT, they told that to their GP. They're like, hey, I want to access testosterone. And their GP was like, okay, you have to go do a full psychiatric assessment before I'll let you be on hormones. You have to go pay $2,000 for a private doctor to give you a full psychiatric assessment. And you know what that patient did? They paid $2,000 to go get a private doctor to give them a psychiatric assessment. This 15-year-old did that. And they did that, and it was completely unnecessary. They didn't need that psychiatric assessment for anything. It was a completely useless year wasted of their time when they could have been on hormones, when they could have been preventing like the various like aspects of their puberty that were like happening to them. It was a complete waste of their time, and there was nothing stopping that doctor from saying that. There's nothing stopping that doctor from making up whatever standards of care they want, from enforcing them. Even if the patient had literally told that doctor, I know you're lying and that that's not necessary, the doctor can still force them to do it. Um, because there's nobody preventing doctors from using whatever like barriers to access to care that they want as part of their personal discretion in their medical care. And like young trans people in our experience are the ones most likely to be targeted with these discriminatory and outdated and expensive and time wasteful like practices. This is what we think about when we think about like the targeting of trans youth, like in the broader trans culture war or whatever. This is like the kind of thing that's going to get worse. Just the other day at another medical clinic, this was a few months ago, at another medical clinic in Montreal. I'm not using names here because I'm being very responsible right now, but like at another health clinic in Montreal, a doctor who provides this is like a youth and young adult health clinic. Um, the doctor there who provided HRT left the clinic to go somewhere else. Doctors leave sometimes, it happens. Um, and they found 4 new doctors to replace this doctor around the same time, and it was very exciting. And none of these doctors were willing to prescribe HRT to patients. They were, especially to young patients, they were completely unwilling to do so. They were given every resource under the sun, but they objected on principle because they were like, I don't want to be held accountable for anything. They're worried about the political climate surrounding hormones, and it's pressuring them not to provide care for young trans people. This is like one of the big like tropes is like you reach out for medical care, you get referred to psychiatric care or to mental health care. You're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I want this medical procedure, and they're like, oh, you should go see a shrink, basically. This is their like view of trans people, and it says a lot. And yeah, in that, and it's like in that specific case with that doctor who like was like, oh, go do a $2,000 private psychiatric assessment, right? Like, yeah, it's like um, and it's like, where did he get this standard from that this was like normal? He just like pulled it out of his ass, right? Or maybe he remembered something from a bygone era where that was more normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like that hasn't been normal for like decades, you know? But that's like where a lot of these doctors are at, especially the older doctors. Like they just continue the outdated methods that they heard somebody say from someone else from this telephone game of doctors from like decades ago. And this is like what they're giving their patients. This is what patients are like this is what patients are like often paying for out of pocket or like using their like getting on these long wait lists to go see. I could go on to a whole rant about how this isn't unique to trans healthcare. I think it really shocks people like how little accountability there is for doctors in general, like especially with like oh my god, women's health and like medicine, like it's so over. It's all a mess. Like I know like I we only know this information because we speak to patients directly and document their experiences, and we speak to like often people who work at clinics, often trans people who work at various health clinics in Montreal. It's like common for some doctors to put on their schedules with their like person booking their schedules appointment, like the receptionist or whatever, no female patients after 3:30. Like this is a thing that a lot of doctors do. No female patients after 3:30 because women are annoying. They think women are annoying, and they think women are so much to deal with. They're so stressful, so they don't want any female patients. Don't book me any walk-in appointments with any women after 3:30. There are doctors in Montreal who refuse to see any female patients. They are family doctors paid by the RAMQ, and they see zero female patients, and they will not accept bookings with female patients. And if you call and you try to get a booking with that doctor, they'll tell you he's full. And like, who's preventing doctors from doing that as part of their personal discretion? Who's preventing doctors from saying, I'm kind of vaginophobic. I don't want to do a gynecology. I don't want to do a pelvic exam. Who's preventing doctors from doing these things, from having these practices? There's really nobody like in the day to day who's like standing in their way. And often the clinics are so underbooked and so like overworked. Not underbooked, sorry. They don't have enough bookings, is what I mean. They have so few appointments. They're so overworked. Who are they supposed to hire instead? Who's going to take on the like 200 like patients that like misogynistic doctor has when he like leaves? Who's going to take on those 200 male patients? Like no one. This is like the situation, for so much of healthcare is that there's no like accountability for doctors' personal discretion in their practices. There's no accountability for outdated or discriminatory practices. We just kind of trust doctors to know what's best. Trust your doctor. You have a problem? Don't do your own research. Don't like try and learn anything about it yourself. You should always trust your doctor. What happens when your doctor sucks? Like, you can go see a second medical opinion. What happens if like you live in a healthcare system where your issue is like marginalized and there's no proper education on your healthcare issue? What happens if you have to wait? What happens if you waited on a year-long waiting list to see that first doctor in the first place? You know, these are kind of like the bigger issues that we wrestle with, like as an organization, when it comes to like, even if we provide better information for doctors like on the onset, this is kind of like why we exist as a union, right? Like for us, it's like there's the medical aspect of like these doctors need to be educated more. There's also the empowerment aspect. Like there needs we strongly believe that like patients are a necessary check in the creation of good standards of care. Like we understand things about our own experiences, we understand things that the clinics don't know about their own providers, and we understand things about practices and our like how patients are treated that like is an important check in like ensuring that doctors are accountable for like outdated, discriminatory, and otherwise harmful practices to patients.
How has well, we kind of talked about it, but how has the access to healthcare for trans patients changed under the CAC government?
Um, I haven't been an organizer in the scene that long. I've been working basically for 2 years, so I don't know how well I can answer this question. If I had to guess, I would say it hasn't changed enormously. Most of the actual things that impact standards of care is not controlled by specific policies. In fact, introducing policies like, oh, no puberty blockers or whatever is quite odd, since usually these things are not left up to politicians. Usually these decisions are made by the medical, various like, big shot medical groups and associations that are in charge of dedicating standards of care, like organizing all these clinics, all these like various important like bodies in the medical establishment. It's not usually like politicians who decide like, how many doctors there's going to be at X or Y clinic, apart from like the funding, of course. Um, but yeah, yeah, I would say I'm probably not the best person to answer this question. I haven't been around long enough, haven't seen enough governments.
No worries, honestly. I had like a variety of questions just in case. So I think you kind of answered that a little bit. But how are organizations and individuals across Montreal mobilizing to make access to healthcare easier?
It's a lot. I think that the most exciting. I might be biased because I'm part of like a grassroots organization, but I do think that the most exciting organizing, um, that's some of the, at least some of the most exciting organizing for like trans healthcare and trans patient stuff happens sort of like on a very like grassroots and like individual level often. Like in Quebec, fertility preservation is covered by RAMQ. But for trans people, I mean, if you're a trans person and you're beginning HRT, this puts at risk your fertility. You can get fertility preservation beforehand, and this is covered by RAMQ. This is actually not widely known, but it is covered by RAMQ. Sometimes we speak to doctors who tell their patients it isn't covered by RAMQ because they don't know, blah blah blah. But it's not widely known, but it is covered by RAMQ, and there's 3 clinics in Montreal that will do this. Um, and what's it called? And the fact that it's covered by RAMQ is actually an accident. The wording of the RAMQ policy and the government's policy for who should be covered was mistaken. Basically, their wording accidentally included trans people, and this was noticed by one trans woman. There's like a trans woman in Montreal who noticed this in the policy and tried to use it to get her fertility covered, and basically like found a pathway to get it covered, and that's why it's covered today. That's why we know that it's covered today, and that's why people can get it covered today. It's because one person went, "Oh wait, there's a loophole here. We need to like use it to get this coverage," and then everybody else learns about it through like the grapevine of trans people and like organizations. And like this is like a huge way that like the advocacy happens. In fact, we kind of think of our own organization as like a more institutionalized version of those practices. You know, um, right now we're trying to find a way to get laser and electrolysis covered by the province, because there are cases where laser and electrolysis will be covered by the province's insurance if you're a cis woman who has PCOS. They will cover your laser hair removal for any facial hair that grows because of your PCOS. But like trans women don't get the same coverage for their facial hair. So A lot of this push, I think a lot of the exciting push for like getting better access to coverage like comes like from the grassroots level of like people basically like pushing individual providers and individual pathways one at a time. I mean, hell, a lot of the time, the way that HRT becomes covered as a clinic by a clinic is because a patient there will insist that their doctor provide it for them, and they will insist again and again and again until they say yes, and then more patients will learn about that pathway, and they will go see that doctor.
Thank you. What tips and practical advice would you be able to give anyone looking for support in accessing healthcare as a trans patient?
Ooh, we have like a whole workshop on this. There's a lot of stuff. Um, I say the first thing, like, get a network of trans people. If you don't already have one, get a network of trans people that you can rely on personally and also just like for various healthcare like concerns. If you're a trans patient, don't feel too shy about asking other trans patients that you just kind of casually know about advice. Like most trans people are pretty open to sharing their own experiences with other trans people and providing advice because we kind of know that's how it works, like to pay it forward. Um, if you need there are tons of organizations that exist in the city. Some have better resources than others when it comes to this sort of stuff. Check out our resource index. We have a giant, we have a mega list. We have a list of all the existing lists of HRT providers in Montreal. If you're looking for HRT, that's a good place to start. If you're worried about surgeries, GRS is usually decent when it comes to their correspondences by email and by phone, and are usually decent about answering questions despite all the issues that patients have at GRS. They do usually pick up their phone, unlike many clinics. Um, uh, Generally, it's important as a trans patient to learn to stand up for yourself. There's sort of this delicate balance where you have to be firm but also gentle. You need to be you need to be able to stand up for yourself and in the doctor's office and insist that you get certain parts of your care, especially if your doctor kind of sucks. But you need to be careful not to be so strong that your doctor will get cagey and they'll be like, oh, like get out of my office, basically, or like shut down and just like ignore you altogether. There's like a delicate balance where you need to be like very insistent but not scare them off. Um, and Do your own research. Your doctor might tell you that they know everything about trans care, and that is probably not true. Your doctor might tell you many things about trans care. We speak to patients all the time who have doctors who see hundreds of trans patients, and their doctors provide all hundreds of those patients misinformation about trans care. We spoke to a patient who's had a doctor who's like sees hundreds of trans patients who was telling all of her patients on estrogen that estrogen wouldn't make them infertile for 10 years. You know, this is just what she was telling all of her, and of course it makes you infertile basically like right away. Like as soon as you go on it, you are risking your fertility, and like hundreds of patients that wanted access to fertility will now never have it. You know, like it's doctors make serious mistakes when it comes to trans people because they're not provided good resources and good education on trans people. So you do need to basically be a little bit of your own doctor. You need to fact check these things. You should do your own research. You should ask other trans patients. If a doctor says something that sounds suspicious about trans care or trans people, it probably is, and you should look into it. You should get a second medical opinion, reach out to your trans network and like hear what's up. Is this a common myth that doctors perpetuate all the time? You should do research into like the medical stuff yourself. You know, people act like studies are like indecipherable codes that only doctors can understand. There are not that many studies on a lot of the issues that matter to trans people. You can read 5 studies, okay? Like, it's not like as complicated as people might think. And if you're going to be a trans patient, honestly, you should familiarize yourself with the medical literature as much as you can. There are entire websites and resources online that trans people make for each other specifically for this purpose.
Thank you. That is honestly that is such valuable insight. So thank you so much. I did want to ask if there is anything I did not ask that you would maybe like to discuss or anything else you wanted to add.
I don't think so in particular. Thank you so much for this. I apologize that this took much longer than we initially thought it would. Thank you so much for this really lovely interview.
Thank you.